Landlord picked the wrong tenant. I ruined his life and walked away with $13,000 in free rent. All right, gather round. You're about to hear the wildest revenge story you've ever read. Get comfortable, because this isn't your run-of-the-mill landlord-tenant drama. This is a saga of negligence, betrayal, and cold, calculated payback. And by the end, I walked away with $13,000 in free rent. For context, I spent 2 decades working in security, but not your average mall cop stuff. One of my most unique and most useful roles was working at the Rental Housing Tribunal, RHT, in a major city. If you've ever seen courtroom dramas, you know the vibe: a bit of formality, high stakes, and tense confrontations. Only, instead of a judge, there were adjudicators who made binding decisions. I sat through dozens, no, hundreds, of landlord-tenant disputes, hearing both sides and learning the ropes. By the time I left, I knew the system inside and out. I knew what landlords could get away with, what they couldn't, and most importantly, how to make them sweat. I even learned about that little quirk where adjudicators are a bit kinder to tenants representing themselves. It's a subtle trick, but trust me, it's one that would come in handy later. So when I moved from the city to a larger town, I didn't expect things to get as crazy as they did. I thought I was just getting away from the noise of city life, living in a peaceful townhouse with a few roommates. The rent wasn't cheap, but it was manageable. I paid the rent every month on behalf of the group since I was the only one who could write checks, and we always made sure to get the payment in by the 3rd of the month, no exceptions. We weren't paying early, but it was always paid on time, and the landlord was totally okay with this. I thought we had a great relationship, and that was that, until one day, things took a nasty turn. The calm before the storm, how it all fell apart. At first, everything was fine. The landlord was cool, and everything seemed to be running smoothly. Sure, there were occasional delays in rent, but the guy was reasonable. There were no red flags, no hint that things were about to explode. We paid by the 3rd every month, and every time, we were met with no complaints. But then, out of nowhere, we get a summons from the Rental Housing Tribunal, RHT, for failure to pay rent. I thought, okay, this must be a mistake. We always pay by the 3rd. But no. Apparently, the landlord decided that one day past the 1st was enough to file a summons, which meant we were hit with the landlord's application fee. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, this was a blatant attempt to milk us for money that wasn't even deserved. I vented about it to the superintendent, who happened to be our neighbor. Turns out, a new guy had taken over for the landlord, and this guy was extra strict about rent being paid on the 1st, with no room for flexibility. No longer was there the understanding that the landlord could tolerate a little late rent. The grace period we'd had for over a year was gone, replaced with an ironclad rule of paying by the 1st or else. This was not the same landlord I'd been dealing with for the past year. The shift in attitude felt personal, like they were suddenly looking for a reason to punish us for being a day late. Sure, the rent was always paid by the 3rd, but suddenly we were being targeted. I smelled something fishy. Maybe it wasn't just about the rent, it was about control. Maybe the new guy wanted to prove he could manage things better, or maybe he had his own agenda. Either way, I was about to find out just how bad it could get. The breaking point: losing patience, losing roommates. Here's where things get interesting. As time passed, things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. Around the time the landlord's demands shifted, things started falling apart in the townhouse. Not physically, though, it was the tenants who started to disappear. Within a 4-month period, every single one of my roommates left. Some moved for work, some for personal reasons, but no matter the excuse, the end result was the same: I was left alone in this hellhole. This wasn't just some cozy home anymore, it was a broken, neglected wreck. And you know what? I wasn't going to keep throwing money at it. But I didn't just pack up and leave. That would have been too easy. I could have moved out, found a new place, and walked away from all of it. But I'd been saving up, and I'd been stewing over this situation for a while. I had the knowledge. I knew exactly how to hit back at the landlord without just walking away quietly. No, this wasn't going to end in silence. The landlord thought they had the upper hand. They thought they could control the situation. They didn't realize they were dealing with someone who had spent years learning how to make landlords sweat. I wasn't going to let this stand. I stopped paying rent. The first month went by without a hitch. No summons. No phone calls, no threats. It was almost as if they didn't care, or maybe they were giving me space to come around. By the second month, I received my first summons. But by then, I wasn't just some ordinary tenant anymore. I was ready to make them pay, in ways they hadn't even dreamed of. The master plan, not paying rent and gathering evidence. I knew this was going to be a long game, but I had the patience. I wasn't about to give up now. I was playing chess while they were playing checkers. So, when that summons arrived, I didn't panic. Instead, I got organized. I dug through everything, the maintenance requests I'd made, the photos I had of broken appliances, and the illegal entries that the landlord had made into the townhouse without giving notice. This wasn't just petty vengeance. This was strategic warfare. I didn't just walk into the RHT with some paperwork and hope for the best. I was going in prepared. I spent weeks compiling my evidence. I was meticulous. I gathered photos of every leaky roof, every broken fridge, and every maintenance request that had gone unanswered for months. I made sure that my case wasn't just strong, it was unassailable. But I didn't just show up and hand over the evidence right away. No, that would have been too easy. I knew the tricks from my RHT days. I was going to ambush them. I waited until the last possible second to hand over the evidence. This was my way of playing the system, taking advantage of that little leeway given to tenants representing themselves. The landlord and their lawyer didn't see it coming. You could almost feel the tension when I handed over my evidence at the hearing. The shock on their faces was priceless. They had absolutely nothing to counteract my case. They tried to argue that I was ambushing them, but the adjudicator wasn't having any of it. He dismissed their case before it even began. They'd spent all that time driving 3 hours to the hearing, only to lose instantly. They couldn't even get their defense in before it was torn to shreds. The look of defeat on their faces was like watching a slow-motion car crash. The final showdown, winning big and making them pay. At this point, I knew I was going to win, but it wasn't over yet. I filed my own summons after the hearing, confident that I was about to hit them where it hurt the most. This wasn't just about getting compensation, it was about making them regret ever crossing me. The next hearing was the big one. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. I walked into the room with an entire binder of evidence. Dozens of photos, a timeline of every failed repair request, and a clear paper trail showing how the landlord had ignored every responsibility. I had receipts from plumbers, contractors, and maintenance companies that proved how they'd never taken care of the property. Meanwhile, the landlord came to the hearing with nothing. They tried to argue that I was late on rent, but that was nothing compared to the issues they had neglected. The adjudicator could see that. He could see the blatant negligence from the landlord. They had nothing to say. The landlord's lawyer tried to interrupt, but each time they did, the adjudicator shut them down. By the end of it, I had won in every sense of the word. I didn't just get the rent I'd been missing for the past several months, I got 9 months of free rent. The landlord was also ordered to fix every single issue with the townhouse, or I'd be entitled to even more compensation. I had officially walked away with $13,000 in free rent. The sweetest victory, a $13,000 judgment. Adjudicator's ruling was like music to my ears. It wasn't just the free rent, which was a huge win. It was the satisfaction of watching this landlord who thought they could run roughshod over me suddenly be forced to pay for their own negligence. They were ordered to fix everything, or face even more consequences. The townhouse had been a dump, with plumbing issues, a broken fridge, and God knows how many other problems that had gone ignored for far too long. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. And the best part? They had no choice but to comply with the ruling. I gave notice that I was leaving after 8 months, but I didn't need to give the full 3 months notice they would normally expect because they'd never renewed my lease. As far as I was concerned, the moment they messed with me, they lost any right to make demands. After 9 months of free rent, I packed my bags, walked out the door, and left the landlord with nothing. But that wasn't even the best part. You know what was sweeter than the $13,000 I walked away with? The look on the landlord's face when they realized they had lost. The humiliation of having to pay for all the repairs, and worst of all, the fact that they had to drive 3 hours, twice, just to get utterly destroyed in court. I honestly thought the guy was going to have a stroke. His face went as red as a tomato when the adjudicator handed down the decision. The lawyer was just sitting there, seething with frustration. They tried so hard to intimidate me, but in the end, they were the ones who were left with nothing. I'll never forget the satisfaction of knowing I had outsmarted them every step of the way. They thought they could take advantage of a tenant who was desperate and uninformed, but they were wrong. The aftermath, a red-faced landlord and sweet satisfaction. That moment, seeing their faces as the ruling was read out loud, was priceless. I could feel the air leave the room as their entire defense collapsed. They couldn't argue the facts anymore. The adjudicator had seen through all their lies and pointed out how they'd failed to maintain the property. This was a humiliating loss for the landlord, and it was a sweet victory for me. The best part? I didn't even have to deal with the hassle of moving out in a rush. I had 9 full months of rent-free living, and by the time I left, the landlord was stuck with the bill for all those repairs. They had no choice but to fix everything or face even more financial penalties. I got to walk away victorious, knowing that every moment of frustration, every headache, had led to this moment of triumph. I'm sure the landlord learned a hard lesson that day, but it wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about holding people accountable, and in this case, the landlord had taken advantage of us for long enough. They thought they could wear us down with little fees and dismiss our complaints about the property, but I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I wasn't going to just roll over and accept it. And I didn't. Final thoughts, a bitter, beautiful victory. So, yeah, I know some people will call me petty or say I went too far. But honestly, I don't care. What I did wasn't about being vindictive, it was about making sure that someone who wronged me paid for it. The truth is, this landlord was neglectful, dismissive, and downright irresponsible. There are good landlords out there, I've seen them, but this one, he wasn't one of them. And let me tell you, it felt so good to win. I'm not some kind of hero, and I'm certainly not trying to paint all landlords as villains. But this one deserved everything they got. I've seen both sides in my years working at the RHT, and I know the struggle of both good landlords and good tenants. But there's a special place in hell for landlords who take advantage of their tenants. If you're a good landlord, I feel for you. But if you're like this guy, you'd better watch out. Because you might just mess with the wrong person. Edit. Since some people have asked about the ratio of good tenants to good landlords, let me just clarify. I'm not trying to paint all landlords as evil. I know there are a lot of good ones out there, and I've seen them in action. But this guy? He was the exception. I've had some difficult tenants in my time, and I know that not every tenant is a saint. But when a landlord acts like this, ignoring repairs, breaking the law, and trying to milk their tenants for every penny they can, they deserve to be called out. I'm not against landlords as a whole, but this particular one was a nightmare. Edit 2. A lot of people are asking about the ratio of bad tenants to bad landlords, and after thinking about it some more, I've revised my estimate. It's probably more like 1 bad landlord for every 10 bad tenants. But the thing is, there are so many more tenants than there are landlords, which means there are inevitably more bad tenants in the system than bad landlords. It's a numbers game, really. But trust me when I say that when a landlord messes with the wrong tenant, it can end up being a major mistake. And in my case, it was the worst mistake he could have made.